Hello, U.S. history people. This is Mr. Lawback. In this video, I'm going to go over the lead up to the Revolutionary War from 1767 to 1773. Many historians call this the second phase in the lead up, the first phase being the Stamp Act and the repeal of the Stamp Act, and the time right after the conclusion of the French and Indian War. In the video, we are going to go over the Townshend Acts. Now, they're sometimes referred to as the Townshend Acts. I'm going to refer to them as the Townshend Acts of 1767, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania by John Dickinson, the Massachusetts Circular Letter by James Otis and Samuel Adams, the Boston Massacre. We will touch on that a little bit, but go into more detail on that in class, the Committees of Correspondence, and the Gaspee Incident. So this is a famous quote from John Adams. Now, John Adams was one of the founding fathers. He eventually became the vice president to George Washington, and he was the second president of the United States. He played a very prominent role during this time period in the move to independence and the earlier part of the Republic. And HBO has a great series, John Adams, about his life. And then his son, John Quincy Adams, went on to be a very important Secretary of State and ultimately was a one-term U.S. president. So John Adams in 1765 said, "The people, even to the lowest ranks, have become more attentive to their liberties, more inquisitive about them, and more determined to defend them." Now, what caused the American colonists in the 1760s to become, as John Adams expressed, more attentive to their liberties? The chief reason for this discontent in these years was a dramatic change in Britain's colonial policy. Britain began to assert its power in the colonies and to collect taxes and enforce trade laws much more aggressively than in the past. Remember, salutary neglect had been abandoned. While some colonists accepted these changes, others grew angry in defense of what they viewed as violations of their political rights and their ability to carry on trade and commerce freely. As anger spread, colonists from Massachusetts to Georgia began to unite in protest of the British actions, and they did this in a variety of forms. So let's do a little review. One of the big complaints of the colonists was that if they are going to be taxed, they need to be represented in Parliament. The colonists pointed out that they could not directly elect representatives to Parliament, so they had no way to consent to or oppose British actions. Remember that a rallying cry of the colonists was no taxation without representation. On the other hand, the British responded that the colonists, like all British citizens, had virtual representation in government. According to this theory, all members of Parliament represented the interests of the entire empire, not just the small district that chose them. The British government still needed new revenue. To obtain it, the newly appointed Chancellor, Charles Townshend, proposed another tax measure. Now, at this time, William Pitt, who had been pretty much favorable and promised the colonists that he would take good care of him, was the prime minister, but he was very sick, and part of his cabinet was this individual named Charles Townshend, who is the namesake for these acts. The Townshend Acts, sometimes called the Townshend Duties, was when Parliament in 1767 enacted new duties to be collected on colonial imports of tea, glass, and paper. The revenue would be used to pay crown officials in the colonies, thus making the officials independent of colonial assemblies that had paid their salaries in the past. The Townshend Acts also provided for the search of private homes for smuggling. All that an official needed to conduct such a search would be the writ of assistance, a general license to search anywhere, rather than a judge's warrant to search a specific property. This gave the British government a lot more power to look for smugglers in the colonies. A related act suspended New York's assembly for its defiance of the Quartering Act. At first, most colonists accepted the taxes because they were indirect, meaning they were paid by merchants who then raised their prices to cover the additional costs. They were not direct taxes that consumers paid on the purchases, like the Stamp Act. So many of the colonists didn't really even notice the Townshend Act duties that were added. However, leaders soon protested the new duties. While they accepted Parliament's right to regulate trade as legitimate, they rejected taxation without representation as a violation of an essential principle of English law. In 1767 and 1768, John Dickinson made these points in a letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. He argued that Parliament could regulate colonial commerce, but if it wanted to tax colonists, it had to have approval of assemblies that included colonial representatives. Now, John Dickinson supposedly wrote these letters anonymous, but everyone knew that he was the one writing them. And John Dickinson wasn't actually a farmer from Pennsylvania. But these letters were very important to the ultimate repeal of the Townshend Act. In 1768, James Otis and Samuel Adams jointly wrote the Massachusetts Circular Letter and sent copies to every colonial legislature. It urged the colonies to petition Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. British officials in Boston ordered the letter retracted, threatening to dissolve the legislature and increase the number of British troops. Responding to the circular letter, the colonists again conducted boycotts of British goods. Remember, they did this as a result of the Stamp Act. Merchants increased their smuggling to avoid the Townshend duties. Meanwhile, in London, there was another change in the King's ministry. Lord Frederick North became the new Prime Minister. He urged Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts because they damaged trade and generated a disappointingly small amount of revenue. The repeal of the Townshend Act in 1770 ended the colonial boycott, and except for the incident in Boston, the Boston Massacre, which we'll talk about in a moment, there was a 3-year respite from political troubles as the colonies entered into a period of economic prosperity. However, Parliament retained a small tax on tea as a symbol of its right to tax the colonies. So let's talk about the Boston Massacre of 1770. We will go more into this in class. Most Bostonians resented the British troops quartered in their city to protect customs officials from attacks from the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. On a snowy day in March 1770, which ironically was the same day the Townshend Acts were repealed in Parliament across the Atlantic, a crowd of colonists harassed the guards near the customs house. The guards fired into the crowd, killing 5. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of mixed African and American Indian heritage, who would later become a symbol for the anti-slavery movement, and many people said he was the first person killed in the American Revolution. At their trial for murder, the 6 soldiers were defended by colonial lawyer John Adams. They were acquitted of murder, but 2 were convicted of the less serious charge of manslaughter. Adams' radical cousin, Samuel Adams, angrily denounced the shooting accident as a massacre and used it to inflame anti-British feeling. The Boston Massacre took place 5 years before the Revolutionary War began, and Paul Revere made a famous engraving about the massacre that was publicized throughout the colonies and angered many of the colonies. Now, what exactly happened that night in March, which we know as the Boston Massacre, is much disputed and is a great example of colonist propaganda being used as anti-British sentiments. Even during the relatively quiet years of the 1770s to 1772, Samuel Adams and a few other Americans kept alive the view that British officials were undermining colonial liberties. A principal device for spreading the idea was by means of the Committees of Correspondence, initiated by Samuel Adams in 1772. In Boston and other Massachusetts towns, Adams began the practice of organizing committees that would regularly exchange letters about suspicious or potentially threatening British activities. The Virginia House of Burgesses took the concept a step further when it organized intercolonial committees in 1773. Another incident adding to the discontent of the colonists towards the British was the Gaspee Incident, or sometimes called the Gaspee Affair. This incident was discussed frequently in the Committees of Correspondence letters. A British customs ship that had caught several smugglers ran aground off the shore of Rhode Island. Seizing their opportunity to destroy the hated vessel, a group of colonists disguised as American Indians ordered the British crew ashore and then set fire to the ship. The British ordered a commission to investigate and bring these individuals that perpetrated this to Britain for trial. Now for some big takeaways. The Townshend Acts were passed and then repealed, much like the Stamp Act was. This was seen as a big victory for the colonists. Another big takeaway, literature and publications played an important role in the lead up to the Revolutionary War. So one of the things that the colonists were avid readers throughout the colonies. Some examples from this video were the letters from a farmer in PA penned by John Dickinson, the Massachusetts Circular letter penned by James Otis and Sam Adams, and Paul Revere's engraving, which shortly became known as the Bloody Massacre, but was called the Bloody Massacre perpetrated on King Street in Boston, and of course the Committees of Correspondence, also led by Sam Adams. One more takeaway. Even through the early 1770s, it is important to note that most colonists wanted to remain as British citizens. They just wanted to be treated more fairly in their eyes.